we've seen this even more during coronavirus. We live in a country that's not well served by fibre optic networks compared with other parts of the world. I think there's only 10% of households that can get full fibre. And yet we've just gone through a pandemic where everybody's been forced into their homes.
And we've coped.
And we've had no outages at all, no signs of any, everybody's watching Netflix and Amazon.
I completely agree.
There's no need for throttling anyway.
I completely agree with your red herring
It's a
assessment.
stupid argument. And I just like it to be put to death, actually, completely.
Hello and welcome to an early and what will be the last for a month studio podcast because we've just had lockdown
maybe even longer.
Tier 4. Well, so we were just chatting about that, Ian, weren't we, on the way? And you were going, Scott, do you reckon that they're going to lift it on December the 2nd, which is the sort of nominal date they put?
Yeah.
And I was saying on the back of some articles in The Spectator where they've come out with this worst case scenario planning, which apparently a government's basing all its decisions on.
Which is out by a factor of 4 anyway, apparently.
Yeah, well, we know the data's all over the shop. I mean, they're still talking to that bloke Ferguson, who's spending half his time nailing his bit on the side anyway.
And he's already been proven wrong on various things.
So, the fact they're still listening to him, it's just like, okay, fine.
I think the goal is to get it down to an acceptable level before Christmas.
Well,
so people can buy stuff.
So we can have 1. Christmas.
Huh?
The R number's only just above 1. According to Boris. So 4 weeks should get that underneath, and then we can get back to business in the studio in December. Hopefully, but the flip side, and I've got flights to Canary Islands booked for late December. I think you'll be fine.
Right, well, we'll go Pete Tom.
I mean, Christmas will be a organic, 1 week sort of lockdown. People won't move that much.
I don't know. It's so arbitrary. But
people want to go and spend time with their families, don't they? 12 people in a house eating turkey or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when we pop out later, we've got to make out that we all live with each other, just so they'll let us sit at the same table in the house. It's all right. I don't think the White Hart listens to the pod.
The government is.
Yeah, the government is. Yeah, I wish I could give them that. I wish I could believe they're that competent that they're like, oh, hold on, we've spotted some naughty people. Anyway.
Yeah.
So let's see. But it'll be, we'll switch to remote, won't we? That's the plan. Back
to what?
Remote, like we did in the summer, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But this will be the last studio one.
Ian is getting a good mic.
So we've got some tins, we've got some neck oil. We all like a bit of neck oil. And the trippy sort of designs. Do you know that neck oil's brewed by Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin's
Baby
son?
Skulls Eating Landscapes.
Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it?
There should be more of that, I think.
Although
I had one,
a big chunk of it is owned by Heineken, though.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
They're a big investor.
Yeah.
I had, when I go on the train and a tin mysteriously goes missing from my bag, but it's not drunk by me.
Cheers.
Well, cheers. That happened this time. I just put 1 tin in because I knew I was behind you guys because I actually have to work for a living, not like you slackers. And I had 1 tin in my bag, and when someone else stole it off me and opened it in the train, it kind of fucking went everywhere because I had to run for the train.
Someone nicked it?
No, that's just me covering my ass, isn't it? Stop ruining the little game. Okay. Right. Stop procrastinating and get on with it. Just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify and loads of other podcasting platforms. We are recording this the day after the US general election. I know that's got fuck all to do with telecoms.
It's more like during at this point.
Well, it's during, yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, they can't figure out.
Yeah, thanks for like interrupting my narrative flow. I was kind of leading up to that, but no, you know better, don't you? And it's not really telecoms-y, but I think we can find some telecoms justification, and it's just interesting because as Pierre just said, it's up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you want to read the numbers?
Right. Okay. So the numbers you've got on your Wall Street Journal page you got open. Biden's got 238 electoral college votes, and Trump's got 213. But the thing is, a lot of the swing states. So one swing state came for Trump, which is Ohio. He basically needs to win nearly all the swing states. And there's some that are incredibly tight. Like Wisconsin's like down to a few thousand votes one way or the other. Michigan's tight. Pennsylvania, it looks like he's won, which is the other swing state he had to win. I don't think...
Which one?
Pennsylvania.
No, not at all.
That's not so tight anymore, is it?
As we're talking, he's 12% down. So Trump is still massively in the lead on this one.
Yes. So Trump's in the lead on Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has ever won the US presidential election
without winning.
If they lost Ohio and Pennsylvania. It always comes down to these Rust Belt, Midwest sort of jobbies.
Well, I think Pennsylvania is the fourth most electoral.
Yeah, it's 20.
Yeah.
And Trump won Florida. That was a key one. If he lost Florida, it was game over. And he won that. Anyway, so, a lot of this, we shouldn't dwell on it because by the time this is published, a lot of this will be obsolete.
How many electoral votes does California have?
55.
Yeah.
55.
It's
well, that's
biggest.
a lot.
Yeah, it should probably be even bigger by its population.
It's California at 55, biggest, then 38 for Texas.
It is such a bizarre system, I have to say. I mean, I know, there's no perfect systems, and we can talk about proportional representation and all those things, but I find it utterly bizarre that you have a system that works on these lines where someone apparently lost the popular vote last time by couple of million votes or something and still manages to...
Trump lost the
and
popular
this
vote.
has now happened several times and there doesn't seem to be any effort to sort of constitutional amendment
but the problem with that is there's proportional representation, which actually I used to feel very hostile towards, but I'm increasingly warming to.
Well, it's more democratic.
It's more democratic, but also the reason I was hostile to it is actually the reason I'm warming to it, because it tends to produce coalitions and parliamentary deadlocks.
Yeah.
And that was why I used to be hostile to it. But politicians and political parties are so useless.
Yeah.
That actually better that they be deadlocked and better that they be
some countries have managed to do it and function effectively.
Germany's always...
Israel's a classic the strongest example.
Do you want to announce what we're going to talk about first, and then?
Yes, of course. Sorry.
This is all related to telecom.
I know, but I haven't even done the bit where Pierre gets to put the captions up. Okay, So as you may have guessed, we're going to talk about the US election first. Then we're going to talk about two staples. Partly because it's a Wednesday and there's only been 3 days of news, so we're falling back on what's familiar. We're going to talk about OpenRAN.
There's been quite a lot of OpenRAN news.
Yeah, fair enough.
From Europe.
And we're going to talk about Huawei.
Yep.
Okay, happy now, Pierre?
Yeah.
But I will try and discipline us. Obviously, you didn't tune into this podcast just to hear yet another bunch of people bang on about the US general election. But it is interesting, not just because it's on a knife edge, which most people didn't think it would, and not just because of what it says about just the state of things, but there are some telecoms things that we can talk about. For example, Section 230, which I've spoken about recently, net neutrality and a few other things. The reason politics and telecoms do overlap in the States is because the FCC, they're all political appointments. So like with everything else in the States, everything's politicized. I mean, you can't go to the toilet without it being politicized. I'm surprised they don't have Republican and Democrat bog rolls for you to choose between. And on the FCC, they have 6 commissioners and a chairman who's another commissioner. And so that's an odd number. And the party in power always gets to put forward 4, and the party not in power gets to put forward 3. And so we get this whole thing, we must have all written it loads of times, where they make an announcement and Ajit Pai and the Republican people will go, yeah, we're really into this. And there'll be these statements of objections from, I can't even pronounce her name, Jessica Rosenworcel or something like that.
Yeah.
And other
She's
people.
not the head of it, though, is she?
No, but she is one of the Democrat commissioners.
Ajit Pai, as you say, is the...
Yeah, he's the head of it.
She tweets a lot, I've noticed.
Yeah, and they're all playing to their own partisan crowd, and that's fair enough. And on one level, you think this is fine, an adversarial system. But when you've got an adversarial system where it's winner takes all and the party in power gets to pick a majority of the people, it's not really adversarial anymore, is it? It's just that the people...
It's like a pointless debate where the outcome's always going to be certain.
Yeah. And so the losers can just get their sort of, well, we're not happy speech in.
Yeah.
Bit of fucking
they
waste
get to go, nah. And then the result anyway.
They go to, well, I'm not happy.
It's an odd number, isn't it, of commissioners. So it's always and then it's always stacked one way. So you always know what the result's going to be. Would one of them ever buck the party line?
I don't think it happens. I think it hardly ever happens. And they've even got it in the Supreme Court, which is why everyone was freaking out when they just got this, when this venerable Supreme Court member called Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was on the Democrat side. She was properly old. She'd been fighting cancer for ages. And she finally died a few months ago, just before the election. And so Trump quickly got this relatively young woman called Amy Coney Barrett in. And
7 kids.
She's got 7 kids. I know, fair play to her. 2 of them are adopted, though. I'll give her that. But still, 5. Doesn't bear thinking about, does it?
No.
And everyone was freaking out because, of course, if she's a Trump appointee, then she's Republican. And now there's like 6-3. Yeah. And so Supreme Court decisions. And they're there for life.
She's there for, yes, exactly.
And she's quite young. And the lad, there was all that fuss about a few months ago, or was it a year ago? What was his name? Oh, I forget. Anyway, another Republican bloke who everyone freaked out about. So anyway, so there's all this politicisation, but that applies to the FCC as well. So I might as well, before I get completely self-indulgent and go back to just speculating about electoral politics. So the Section 230 thing's relevant because, as I said on a previous pod, Section 230 concerns the protections that internet platforms have, whereby they're not held liable for the content that they publish on the perfectly reasonable grounds that they haven't written it.
Yeah,
it's Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all that. But as they increasingly behave in an editorial capacity, and it's easy to believe that their editorial judgment is skewed in favour of Democrats or leftism or liberals or whatever you want to put that broad political camp, however you want to describe them. And there is certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence of that. I doubt that Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and the people in charge of Google all get together and go, how can we make the world a more lefty place? But they're all Californian companies, and the overriding political culture in California is Democrat and leftist. So I think it just sort of pervades, like the BBC. I'm sure the BBC tries to be impartial and objective, but it just happens that most people it employs have a certain worldview, which is why they get accused of bias.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a top-down policy.
They don't seem to be able to satisfy anybody, the BBC.
Well, that's a good point.
Accused of being a mouthpiece of the Tories.
Well, quite. And we know as journalists, that if both sides are accusing you of being biased, then you're probably doing your job, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're never going to please all the people all the time.
Yeah, the BBC I personally find a bit too left of centre these days, I would say, but I don't know, maybe that says more about me than...
I think it is. You look at the comedy output, you look at Question Time, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's definitely a worldview that's skewed in that direction. Anyway, and so yes, I think that's probably what happens at these big tech companies. But the reason it's relevant a bit to telecoms and stuff we've spoken about before is Section 230. You're getting a lot of Republican senators pushing back, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, a bunch of other guys whose name escapes me, who are just going, hold on a sec, this is biased against us. So obviously they're not happy about what they're viewed as biased against them, but they've got a more reasonable claim that it does undermine democracy.
Yeah.
Because the public discussion does happen on those platforms now, and if one side of the public discussion is being suppressed, then it's reasonable to argue that that's to some degree undermining democracy, isn't it?
Yeah, I find the whole setup odd, to be honest with you, that, as you were saying, that the FCC's political appointees, I mean, you contrast that with what goes on in... It's almost like, because the FCC is the obvious equivalent of that, where we are now, is Ofcom.
Yeah.
And, a government doesn't come in and say, oi, Ofcom, you need to kind of swap out the senior management there and have a complete change in strategy. And, it's...
That's also something very Trumpy. I think he likes to just come in and
but
do
it does
the
happen anyway, doesn't it?
thing.
I mean, it happened under... There was a change under Obama when he came in. I mean, this is one of the things that it relates to, the issue of net neutrality, which has been very politicised. And under the Obama administration, there was a push for an enforcement of that, and rules changed, which all got repealed under Trump. It's all to do with the classification of operators. Quite arcane rules, which we won't go into now. They're Title 1, Title 2, but it basically depends on whether they're utilities or information companies, and then how you regulate them. But depending on how you classify them, it allows you to hit them with harder sort of regulation on this sort of big issue, but I personally think it's a bit of a red herring.
Why is
net
that?
neutrality, because I don't think the net neutrality, which under Trump has become something that is basically not a part of, it's not enforced anymore. So the operators have more, I think they have to report if they're throttling traffic or doing anything like that, but they're not.
So we should just recap, net neutrality is actually about service providers being able to prioritise some traffic over others, basically, isn't it?
Exactly. And the to sort of polarise it, the Democrats would be in the sort of net neutrality camp, i.e. that they think there should be legislation to prevent service providers from doing that. And the idea being, I think, if you boil it down to the basics, the idea is that they can't then sort of discriminate between different websites, for instance, or different services that go over the network, and everybody kind of gets fair treatment. And the Republicans were more kind of, they were more sort of a sort of free for all for the operators, giving them more power and not kind of imposing these heavy restrictions on them. And that's what we've been with for the last 4 years, I guess, ever since.
And do you have any feelings about
now? I always thought this whole issue was a total red herring, personally.
Why?
Well, were there any signs that this was happening anyway? Were there any signs
that they were being really prejudicial
about traffic over their network? I mean, one of the complaints was that if they did this, that I mean, it got contrasted with the situation in Europe, and everybody would say, well, if a particular operator tried to discriminate between content on its site, there's a competitive force in the market to prevent them from, not to prevent them from doing that, but it certainly gives an alternative to customers, and then there's maybe a backlash against that operator, and it doesn't work out in the long run, and that kind of broadband competition's a safeguard almost against it.
So competition, there's the classic thing. That's where it really comes down to when you get into politics. To massively sort of oversimplify and create a perhaps exaggerated dichotomy, but sort of free market versus state.
Yeah.
So there are the more laissez-faire, typically described as right-wing types, of which I'm one.
Yeah.
Who would just say, look, just keep the state out of it. Shit will sort itself out. If you do rubbish things, sooner or later people will go to your competitors.
Exactly. And that was the argument why Europe was a better environment, because apparently in some parts of the US you have very limited. We know this anyway. There's very limited broadband competition. You've only got a choice. So it was a more of a concern of Comcast in a particular area.
Well, and that's where I've got some
was throttling traffic and trying to prioritise certain services.
And that's where I've got some sympathy for the non-laissez-faire side, because I'm sure I've said it before on this podcast, but even Adam Smith back in the late 1700s spoke about cartels, spoke about competition. Anyone who's actually a free marketeer knows you need to have regulation. You can't have a completely unfettered free market, because then you will get the big people conspire to shit on everyone else and rip off the public. I still think
net neutrality is a total red herring, and there's no sign in the years since it hasn't been enforced. So all the stuff the Democrats were pushing for, it's going to be an absolute nightmare for the internet if we don't have net neutrality restrictions. It's going to be awful. Google and those guys will take they'll. This is the old thing about net neutrality. It used to be back in the sort of early days of the net neutrality discussion. It was actually kicked off by AT&T, complaining that companies like Google and YouTube or whatever were using their pipes for free. They were using their pipes and not having to.
We don't talk about OTTs anymore.
Yeah,
but
not
when
having to pay
job,
for that infrastructure, and that side of it's died down a bit, because actually now the concern seems to be that these big internet companies like Google and Facebook and the rest of them will be able to sort of crowd out the smaller rivals, and that the market becomes distorted. But
I think that is a concern, but not a net neutrality concern.
There's no sign of this happening at all in the last few years.
Yeah.
There's no sign of any distortion. Network bandwidth, with new technologies coming along and the improvements we see. We've seen this even more during coronavirus. We live in a country that's not well served by fibre optic networks compared with other parts of the world. I think there's only 10% of households that can get full fibre. And yet we've just gone through a pandemic where everybody's been forced into their homes.
And we've coped.
And we've had no outages at all, no signs of any, everybody's watching Netflix and Amazon.
I completely agree.
There's no need for throttling anyway.
I completely agree with your red herring
It's
assessment.
a stupid argument. And I'd just like it to be put to death, actually, completely. That the whole discussion is so
Fair enough.
It's such a. I mean, what we should be concerned about is. I agree that the power of the big web companies is a concern.
Yes.
It's not. What's not a concern is operators having the right to put their. I mean, this is the whole daft thing about it. Back in the, again, going back to the old days, one of the real worries about net neutrality was that a company like Verizon, trying to promote its own voice over IP service, would discriminate against an over-the-top player that also had a kind of, internet telephony service. And there were cases actually back in the day. The telecom operators don't have a role in over-the-top services anymore. They're not over-the-top services companies. They're utility companies. They are dumb pipes that basically support Netflix, Amazon, Skype, whatever it might be. There's no role for them in that area anymore at all.
Well, there may not be, but so I'm going to be slightly devil's advocate or sort of steelman the net neutrality position. The people who want more regulation and more sort of state interference. They might not be now, but you can see how they could be if the concern is that Netflix or Google or whatever slips them a few mil, and then they prioritise their traffic. Now, one reason I think they have a bit more grounds for concern in the US than in Europe is many markets are not very competitive at all, especially among ISPs.
Yeah, well, this is the issue with there being more broadband competition in European markets. I suppose.
So no one's going to, Virgin or BT or whatever ISP you've got isn't going to try it here because you've just got so many alternatives, and then it's so easy to switch. It's one thing that Ofcom's been working hard on recently, and fair play to them, credit where it's due. They've been putting a lot of priority on making switching easier. For example, this is a complete tangent, I'll just mention it briefly, but they've recently legislated or ruled that you can't lock phones.
Yeah.
That used to be a normal thing, isn't it? You always assumed that if you got your phone, certainly as part of a contract, it'd be locked to that provider.
Yep.
Now they've said it's illegal, and I think that's good. But in the US, you can have some places. So there's only really 2 or 3 big cable providers, isn't there?
Yeah, there's definitely a lack of broadband competition.
And you could have some places where there's no competition at all.
Yeah.
So there, I think they do have some more grounds. I don't think it's a complete red herring in those places.
And if that's a concern, then the issue is not about throttling of traffic or anything to do with, over the top services. It's actually about getting more broadband competition into the market. And there they do have an issue. And they have an issue, and that's why people are paying ridiculous rates to get a broadband connection and a TV service in America, whereas we can get one for like 30 or 40 quid a month here.
The
they're
joke
paying
is always that
$100 or whatever.
Whenever you want to cancel Comcast, they're like, "Oh, really? You want to cancel?"
Yeah, it's like trying to cancel Sky here. Yeah, it's an absolute bloody nightmare. You phone them up and you're on the phone with them for hours, and they offer you.
Making a point is like, you want to cancel us? What are you going to do instead? Is what they say. So they all make it difficult. That's part of the odious thing. Which again, credit to Ofcom for being on top of that. But yes, I agree. Obviously, you only need 2 players.
Yeah.
As long as you've got sufficient regulation to assure they're not behaving like a cartel, then even 2 players is competition.
The thing that strikes me about it is that we've had 4 years of Trump. We've had, for much of that period, I think, we've had net neutrality not being enforced, yeah? And have you heard anything at all about a case where someone's gone, this is carnage now. Now that this Ajit Pai regime's come in, it's bloody carnage. Look what's happening to the internet.
Yeah, and
I've not heard anything about that at all.
You'll get the odd zealot. Like I noticed there's a tech site, quite a venerable tech site called Tech Dirt.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And their editor has certain bugbears. And I get the impression that he's a bit more, where I'm a bit more laissez-faire, he's a bit more state intervention.
Yeah.
And he'll go off on one. Like, he's been writing a lot about the Section 230 stuff. And these people ride that straw man / red herring as far as it will go. And they go, oh my God, it's going to be terrible.
Yeah.
But I think you're right.
There's no sign of any problems at all. There's definitely a concern, I think, about big internet companies being too powerful, but that's not related to net neutrality.
No,
that's just related to
pure competition.
It's just they're into every sector now. They're I mean, look at the stock market valuations and what's happened in the last few months compared with every other company on the planet. And yeah, there's definitely an argument about them being too powerful, but it's not to do with net neutrality.
So I'm going to move it onto more broadly the election, just to see who's going to win. And I've got a note that we had a couple of pints before we came here, and they're catching up with me. So I'm going to have to quickly, nip off, and I'm going to get
right,
Pierre.
If you do this, I'm going to take the opportunity.
You can take your turn in a bit.
Same.
And I think,
and I will as well.
Pierre can fill in the gap by telling us what the current state of play is, what the odds are.
All right, we'll have a catch up on where we are. Okay.
So wait, before we do this, I want to do a quick shout out to our listeners in Columbus, Ohio.
I just killed that camera.
You did?
He's toppled it a bit. It's showing me at a lower height. But
no, you're good. Our listeners in Columbus, Ohio, which were they were big listeners this week.
That's good.
And then we also have people from Port Coquitlam in Canada. I'm gonna Google where that is actually.
Yeah, I'm wondering what. It's funny these little places turn up, isn't it? I mean, Columbus, Ohio is not a little place, obviously, but you kind of wonder what it is that's piqued their interest in a particular week.
Oh, it's just outside Vancouver.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go.
Well, that's good, yeah.
I mean, I don't know why. So here's the interesting thing. If you look at the Wall Street Journal, it says Biden is in the lead by 238 to 213. But if you go on CNN, it's 224 to 213.
Which is what the BBC has at the moment as well.
So I don't know what are those 15 extras that they're counting.
Yeah.
Possibly, I don't know.
And he needs to get to 270 to actually win, yeah? That's the threshold.
Yeah. So there's 6 states in the balance.
Yeah.
3 each. So Nevada, Wisconsin, and Michigan are tilting toward Biden. And then Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania tilting towards Trump. The thing is that the ones tilting towards Trump have more electoral votes than Biden. So we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know.
What did I miss? What's the verdict?
Well, Pierre's just done a good update on the current situation.
So
I must say the Wall Street Journal is doing a good job at explaining the electoral votes to us foreigners, because they have the map, and each state is the state is
broken down into little blocks.
Exactly. So you know if the bigger states means the bigger electoral votes.
So it's 5 states, isn't it? It's Georgia.
6.
Is it?
Well,
Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And Nevada. Nevada, we reckon's going
Which
blue,
are home to about 3 people.
No.
Nevada is actually close.
Pennsylvania, man.
And
Pennsylvania's home to how many people?
It's got Pittsburgh and Philadelphia in it.
Yeah, but how many people live in Pennsylvania?
Well, it's got 20 electoral votes. That's quite a lot.
Yeah, but it's not based on population size, isn't it?
I think it is more or less.
Well, I don't think it was based on population size. I thought that was the whole point.
Well, it can't be that accurate.
You can lose the popular vote, but by
it can't be that accurate,
way,
or you wouldn't keep having.
I thought that was the whole argument about why it needs repealing, is that you can have these, Midwestern states where they've got a huge number of electoral votes, and yet you look at California, which has got 80 million people or whatever.
You look at most of what they call the flyover states, like Iowa or the Dakotas or Montana or something like that. They've only got about 3 electoral college votes, whereas California's got 55.
California's got 50, but it's got a population of 70 to 80 million.
Ton of people, yeah.
So and so, like you say, it's probably too little. Whereas
6th economy in the entire world.
In terms of size.
Yeah,
it's about the size of the UK in just as a state.
But
and it probably doesn't have that because there's presumably resistance. I mean, the Democrats would love. Because they always win California. The Democrats presumably love California to have 1 million electoral college votes.
Someone needs to do a little sort of break up of the map and split it out by electoral votes and population.
I can see an Ian spreadsheet on the horizon.
I might have to do that.
We're seeing an influx of Californians to Texas. As soon as Texas is not obviously red anymore, then there'll be an immediate vote on, you know what, let's can the electoral votes. Let's go for popular votes.
Yeah, that's their big one.
As soon as the Texas...
But it nearly always... So the interesting thing, like Ian was taking a piss because me and Pierre were obsessing about this on our little Teams group. But it is interesting...
I'm going next. Sorry, I can switch cameras.
Yeah, go for it. You go and do your thing, mate. It is interesting, just the dynamics of it, leaving aside the implications, which I think are interesting, which I'll speak about in a sec, but just the dynamics of how it works. It nearly always, something as huge and seismic as this can sometimes come down to a few thousand voters. Like you look at Wisconsin, there's only about a couple of thousand votes separating 2 parties.
Yeah.
And that could be the decider. I mean, if if Biden doesn't win Wisconsin, he's in trouble.
Right.
It'd be interesting, actually.
Which ones do you generally have to win to win it?
So normally the big swing states are Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
To my limited knowledge, America's listening to this will probably like, Scott, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
No, I'm about Ohio always, and Florida always gets sort of called out.
So Trump's banked Ohio and Florida straight away.
Yeah.
So that's immediately a setback because lots of people are calling this. If you go in the polls, how you always get these polls.
The polls have been proven so badly wrong on a lot of things in the last few years.
So that's an interesting thing by itself. So I will say, if I had a vote in the US election, which I don't, last time I probably would have not voted or voted independent. I don't think I could have brought myself to vote for either Clinton or Trump last time. This time I think I would have voted for Trump, not because I think Trump's any less of a divisive figure and any less of a just random crazy-ass wild card than he was before. But we've had 4 years of him doing his worst and it hasn't been that bad. He hasn't killed the world.
Yeah.
I know that's a low bar.
That is a pretty low bar, that is. Yeah.
But, he's not that bad. But the real thing, if I had a vote, the reason I would have voted for Trump is just I find the other lot just so odious, so disingenuous, so dishonest. People have called Trump a liar, and he is. But I swear, man, his lies are just sort of silly. He'll just stand up and go, I'm going to buy Greenland or something. Whereas I just find it much more disingenuous, sneaky, unpleasant, and obviously the identitarian stuff as well.
Yeah.
So that's why I would have, and I suspect the reason I bring it up, because no one really cares where I would have voted, especially if I didn't have a vote. But the reason the polling gets it so far wrong is these what they call shy Trump voters. So there's some people where someone will come up polling, even though they know it's anonymous, there's so much stigma attached to supporting Trump, unless you're a full-on MAGA hat wearing rah-rah type of person, which probably only accounts for, at best, a quarter of the population. So if you're in the middle and you're like, I think I might vote Trump, but I don't want anyone to know because I'll get in trouble.
You just say Biden anyway.
You just say Biden anyway.
That's weird because I always thought that would be more of a sort of English trait than an American one.
I think it's just a human
trait.
That
you go, maybe it is, but you can imagine people coming around to British houses who are from the Labour Party and you really want to vote Conservative. You go, oh yes, actually I am voting Labour this year.
Like if you live in Islington or something. Yeah,
but Americans I always thought was sort of, no man, I'm not doing American.
I know it turns out
people will laugh at me.
Please do.
No man.
But they just seem to be a bit more kind of out there with their views, So I would have thought the differential was less in a US poll than it would be in a UK one.
Turns out not.
But maybe not.
I guess we shouldn't believe. I've just been watching an actor called John Sessions just died, and he's a great impressionist. I've been watching this TV program.
You mean he does a better American accent than I do?
I'm afraid so. And he used a TV program called Stella Street, where they basically had an English suburban street where it was nothing but super duper celebrities lived there, and one of the people who lived there is Joe Pesci. And he does a great Joe Pesci. He's basically Joe Pesci's character out of Goodfellas.
Yeah.
And he's all just like super aggressive and nasty. And, we can have that impression of Americans that they're all like that. But, it's such a massive country, 350-odd million people.
Yeah.
And a lot of people there are just normal, quiet people who just want to get on with living suburban lives and all that sort of thing. Yeah. And maybe they're the ones who would be the shy Trump voters. I don't know. But
the pollsters are obviously not accounting for the shy Trump voters.
Well, and they keep getting it wrong, don't they?
They got it wrong last time. They got it wrong this time.
The thing is that the rest of the world gets an impression of the US from what's on the edges of the state.
And from Hollywood. And that sort
do you know what I find worse than the polls, though, is these attempts to kind of put a percentage on Trump's chance of getting. I mean, The Economist came out with this very sort of. They've been sort of, going on about this one for the last few editions, actually, this percentage chance of Trump being elected. And I don't quite know how they've engineered this model. But for a while it was 10% chance, and then it went down to 5% last week. We're now in a situation where it's, it's in the balance.
Well, I was looking at
it's like, well, how do you get this? Where do you get this 5% chance of him being elected figure from?
It's so silly, just from
arbitrary and stupid.
No, it's more like
from a sensible journal, it's just.
I know. Well, they keep letting themselves down, and all these big polling. That's what I don't get. presumably, if your job is if you're a polling company and your job is to call things, then you shouldn't allow yourself to be in any way politically influenced, because the kudos from getting it right presumably is professionally advantageous. You can go, I'm the guy who called Trump both times when everyone else was saying it wasn't, and then you get lots of work.
Yeah.
But it just infiltrates everything so much. Culture and politics infiltrates commerce now. People aren't just chasing the money. So, yeah, it's quite bizarre. You know, I've got to admit, if Trump does win it, there'd be a part of me that just cracks up, just because of all the people who called it the other way, all the people who insist that anyone who supports Trump is a Nazi.
Yeah.
And you just, you know, I don't think he's great. I'm not a big fan. But just as a sort of up yours thing, that'll make me laugh. So anyway, yeah, I mean, back to how it'll affect business and commerce and that sort of thing. Let's assume that Trump behaves like a normal right-wing person and is more laissez-faire, less regulation, more just let you get on with it. That's not an assumption that I'll necessarily...
Well, I think his reign is perceived to have been pretty good for business generally. The economy's done quite well in America, not as good as his
although
projections.
a lot of that's through sort of protectionism, which is an interesting thing by itself.
Yeah, there's a downside to that as well. But the tax cuts regime that he introduced has done a lot for kind of corporations, and I think Telecom comes into that. AT&T, Verizon, big companies. And, I think a lot of them have had quite a good run of it, I think, in the last 4 years. So,
I've got one other thing that I want to quickly talk about, and then we better move it on.
China.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll come to that because we're going to talk about Huawei last. But obviously, Trump has been very belligerent, very confrontational with China. You could argue that's a bad move, given that they're a massive country and they got nukes and all that sort of thing. But God knows we've spoken about the geopolitical situation with China enough. They do seem to be getting some funny ideas. They do seem to feel at liberty to take the piss when it suits them. And at some stage, someone did at least need to front up and go, all right, China.
Yeah.
Just don't think that it's all going to be going your way. And Trump's done that. And I completely respect him for it. Granted, he's done it in a very idiosyncratic, odd way.
Yeah.
But Obama never did it. No presidents prior to that ever did it. Everyone else was just like softly, yes, let's all get together and in the WTO and all trade with each other, and that'll all work.
Yeah, and on that I totally agree. That's one area where, because I don't like the guy at all.
Yeah.
But I completely agree on the China issue, is that it's very easy to, this criticism was levelled, I think, at Bill Clinton after his reign, and then we had September the 11th horribly, and I think there was a criticism levelled at him that he'd really sort of taken his eye off the ball in terms of
foreign policy
and monitoring what's going on and seeing what's happening in Afghanistan, and I think it was entirely valid. And it's easy to sort of drift through a presidency where you just sort of focus on a few things and you don't really take challenges on.
Yeah.
And you could actually
just sort of fudge a lot of tough
and now
decisions.
He's not a man with any tact or diplomacy, and arguably, yes, you could maybe go about this whole China thing in a different way. But there's no doubt at all that China needs dealing with, Let's be honest.
I think so.
Keep Huawei out of it, like regardless of what Huawei is up to and doing. China is... a country that has clearly flouted a lot of it's in the WTO and has flouted a lot of WTO rules. There's a lot that it's up to politically and militarily that's very dubious. This
whole coronavirus thing and how they do we
want
help.
This to keep going on from year to year? Because at some point in the future, in the same way,
draw a line in the sand, haven't you?
At some point, you're going to have to draw a line in the sand, unless you think it's just going to go away. Or that the Chinese are suddenly going to decide.
There's nothing about Xi Jinping that makes you think that.
No,
he's not an old man. He
all.
seems to be very ambitious.
Yep.
He seems to think, I gather, I'll talk to people, whether it's our colleague Wei or just other people who know more about it than I do, that there's a sense the Chinese have of it being their turn. So, we had the European imperialistic era, then we had the American 20th century, and now it's their turn.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, do we all just go, all right, fair enough?
Yeah.
Or do we go, well,
I think
hold on
there should be a recognition it's not really anyone's turn, Those days are done.
Why has someone got to be the daddy?
Yeah.
There's no more turns since the atomic bomb.
There's no more turns.
Well, there is that.
Yeah.
So, yes. So, fair play on that one. Anyway, so to draw a line on that and then move on. If Trump does win, I think America will continue to have a more confrontational policy towards China.
Yeah.
Although I am seeing some signs that they might be chilling a little bit on that. if Biden comes in, I think it'll be more of an Obama style. Let's meet in the middle. Soft diplomacy.
I don't think there'll be a huge change under Biden. Okay. I think the approach. I mean, Biden's not been he's been quite anti-China, and I don't think there's been a lot of indication that the China policy will change. I think he'll go about things in a different way. He'll try to be a bit more conciliatory, maybe. But I think if companies like Huawei are basing their decisions about strategy in the next few months on the expectations that Biden's going to get in and do something radically different, I think they're being extremely stupid.
No, you're right. And
even
if Biden would be inclined to be soft, Trump's kind of set the precedent now. And if he reversed it,
I don't see it going back. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
All right. Let's move it on.
By the time this goes out, I suppose we'll know.
Well, quite. That's the funny thing about recording this stuff. But we'll turn it around. We'll have it out tomorrow, won't we?
Yeah.
Okay. OpenRAN. You've been writing a lot about that this week, so why don't you
a fair amount,
take the mic?
Well, I suppose, a lot of it comes from the Vodafone announcement at the start of the week, which was prompted by a story in the Financial Times, I think, originally. They'd obviously spoken to Vodafone UK's CTO, Scott Petty.
Yeah.
He's quite good with journalists. Apparently he used to be a journalist.
Really?
Yeah. Apparently Scott Petty, one of the reasons that because I do credit Vodafone with being quite good with the press compared with certain other operators. And,
so we told our mate when he was canvassing opinion the other day.
I did indeed, yeah I did. But they were, before the pandemic, they were very good at getting like press groups together. And Scott Petty was always there, and he always had time to sort of speak to you and give briefings. And apparently, he used to have something to do with journalism. Was a reporter.
So it's possible to be a journalist and actually be a significant human being.
Yeah, he probably did. He probably did something smart at university and then did it as someone who knows things, but rather than me, who just sort of talks crap. But yeah, he'd obviously spoken to the FT and. They got the scoop on this. There wasn't actually an announcement as such, but the gist of the interview, and then we both followed up, obviously, with Vodafone's PR guys. Actually, someone that used to be here.
We'll remain nameless just in case it gets into the shit. But I think everyone can guess.
Yeah, but the gist is that they've sort of made this commitment to replace. I think it's 2,600 sites. Roughly, with that are currently served by Huawei with OpenRAN equipment. So, and they're going through the whole sort of selection process at the moment. And the hope is by I think 2022 they'll be in a position where they can actually start a fairly sort of scaled deployment. They're mainly in rural areas, as I understand it, in the kind of west of the country, southwest and Wales, those sorts of areas. But it's a pretty big chunk of the footprint. It's I think. I was hearing about a third, maybe a bit more than that, of Huawei's estate within Vodafone's network, and therefore quite a big bit of Vodafone's overall UK footprint.
It's hard to say because
maybe it's hard to say because the figures that I'm hearing now are slightly different from some of the numbers that Vodafone UK was coming out with last year, and it's unclear when they talk about 2,600 sites. To me, does that equate to a I'd like to know what the
some network sharing stuff.
They do. They have the whole Cornerstone thing going on, and I'd like to know, how that comes into it a bit more, perhaps, and what it means in terms of their overall network. How many sites is Vodafone UK maintaining across the UK at the moment? But the point is, it's a big chunk of the network.
And the fact it's anything. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's 10%.
Yeah,
that's still quite a commitment to.
It's a big commitment. It's a bigger commitment than any, as far as I can tell. It's a bigger commitment than any other like brownfield operator.
Exactly.
Certainly in Europe, has made
as opposed to
OpenRAN
or Dish or whatever.
Yeah, so we've got the big guys in Japan and America that are building from scratch and making a big deal about OpenRAN, and then you have all the guys who already have networks, and they're all going, well, it's okay. We're trialing it, we're testing it, but we're concerned about its readiness for commercial deployment. And then Vodafone comes out and goes, we're going to use OpenRAN at 2,600 sites. That's quite a big deal, I think.
Yes.
Yes, they're in rural areas. It's not as demanding as putting one up in the middle of London and trying to use it there. But
and apparently one of the technological bottlenecks is the chips.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Which is interesting because I don't know anything about how these things work. But obviously, it's like processing power for capacity. So rural is obviously typically much lower capacity.
Yeah.
I.e. lower volume of traffic.
Yeah.
Who knows? And I think that's interesting. I think we spoke about it last week. There's a lot of new players getting involved in the chip side of things. Qualcomm made an announcement a few weeks ago. AMD's buying Xilinx. I just wrote up a thing this week about Intel's a big partner for Dish.
Yeah.
So all the big semiconductor companies are moving into telecoms, and presumably one of the reasons is exactly what was explained to us over why OpenRAN is a more viable thing in rural rather than urban environments, is this processing capacity by the baseband chips or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, we've heard this a lot and we've talked about it a lot, that it's a technology that's not really able to measure up in terms of cost performance next to the customized stuff that you get from the big vendors, the Ericssons of this world and the Nokias and the Huaweis.
So here's a question: why are they doing it then, in your opinion?
Well, I think Vodafone. I always thought Vodafone, and I remember writing stories about this, was the likeliest to try and use OpenRAN in the UK market, because it's if you look at the network that it's got at the moment, it's heavily reliant on Ericsson. It's phased out or is phasing out Nokia, so it's obviously had some kind of disappointment there, or decided that Nokia is not for its network. And we've talked a lot about Nokia's 5G product problems in the past, and it's under pressure by the government to phase out Huawei. So it needs to, So if you look at it from Vodafone's perspective, they're thinking, well, what are the alternative options? We either beef up Ericsson so that we have a single supplier network that's all reliant on Ericsson, which I don't think is a situation anybody these days really wants to be in, unless you're in very small markets. You sometimes see single supplier deals being done there, but generally speaking, operators in fairly large markets like the UK, they want to have a multi-vendor strategy these days. So, they're not going to go all Ericsson. They probably don't want to bring Nokia back in, and they can't use Huawei. They can't use Samsung, which might be another option, because it doesn't provide support for 2G, which is really important to Vodafone on the M2M side in particular. And they see, I think they see OpenRAN as the only alternative, the only other thing they can really do to try and replace that Huawei equipment without going all in on one of the big kit vendors, and they're obviously worried about doing that. So they always
might as well give it a go.
So they might as well give it a go, and they're doing it in they've got a timeline to do it, which is I think end 2027, when the government says you have to have all Huawei out of your network. It gives them some time to do it, and as I understand it, there's concerns about things being ready even in that time frame. Yep. It's a challenging thing to do. It's not going to be easy.
But you've got to start somewhere.
You've got to start somewhere. They want to be a pioneer to some extent. I mean, they're a very active member of the Telecom Infra Project, which is the Facebook group that's sort of set up to try and pioneer new network technologies at a lower cost. And them, I think, and Telefonica, it's fair to say, have probably been the most active on the operator side. So they've been involved in this for quite a long time. In a lot of ways, it makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Wade just wrote a piece for Telecoms.com this morning about Rakuten joining the ORAN Alliance.
Yeah.
So we've chatted about this. It's sort of house style. Do you write OpenRAN with a space? Do you write ORAN with a hyphen? Do you write, as my default house style is just OpenRAN without a space?
Yeah. I think that's the generic. Yeah. That's the generic way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. But then you realise that it's not just a house style thing. There's the ORAN Alliance, which Wade just wrote about. Rakuten's just joined that.
Yeah.
Which is like one sort of standardization group, you could say.
Yeah.
And then there's TIP, as you just mentioned, which is another. I'm sure they all talk a good game about working nicely with each other.
TIP's not really a standardization group.
But
they work with the ORAN Alliance now. They have an agreement with them. So they're kind of aligned. That's from a standards point of view.
Well, I wish they'd align how they write OpenRAN.
Well, yeah.
Make my life a bit easier.
Can we agree on something?
I mean, my doubt is, and I think
liberals making the wrong thing. Sorry, go on.
My concern, I would say, and I think, if you look above Vodafone perhaps and what's going on at the government level, and it was obviously the government that took the decision to get rid of Huawei, and they talk up OpenRAN a lot as well. You listen to Oliver Dowden's speech to the Commons when he mentioned OpenRAN even in that. It's very odd to hear.
And why do you think he did?
Because I think OpenRAN has become very politicised.
Yeah.
I think it's become a thing that politicians who don't really understand technology, which is always a bad thing, have seized on this particular concept as
Which is all of them.
something that it will address this issue of vendor consolidation on the one hand and needing to get rid of Huawei on the other, which makes the vendor consolidation problem even worse, because you're going to end up with a Nordic duopoly unless you do something to, get other players into the market. And there was a parliamentary briefing last week, when this was discussed, and Ian Livingstone, who's been appointed the head of this task force that's supposed to go out and explore alternatives, is pretty blunt in saying we couldn't. The UK is not in a position now to create a Nokia from scratch, and it might not be a good thing to do that anyway. But but I do think countries see Open RAN as an option because they've heard that you can have small software startups that have only a fraction of the resources of a company like Ericsson and Nokia developing software, and then you can run that over general purpose equipment. And you can sort of, it's easier to kind of get that ecosystem going than it would be to say to pick a national champion of the ilk of Ericsson or Nokia and try and build that up.
No, it's a ridiculous conceit to think that you can just suddenly decide to pick a winner. I mean, governments do it all the time, and it always fails. I can't think of a single example.
But I think that's the danger with Open RAN, that's going to happen, that there will be attempts to try and pick winners, and it becomes very nationalistic. And you can already see that happening to some extent with what Rakuten's doing, where the companies that
NEC
it's picking. Well, it's not only NEC. I mean, Altiostar, which is a US there's this sort of weird US-Japanese axis that's developing, I've noticed, in Open RAN, where, Rakuten basically owns Altiostar. Altiostar claims it's independent, and the fact that Rakuten owns a majority stake doesn't make any difference. Well, of course it bloody does. They own a majority stake in the company, so it's a stupid argument.
That's how owning works.
Yeah, and so effectively Altiostar has a Japanese parent. It's basically a Japanese company,
They can have an American name.
They have NEC doing their hardware. Their CTO has been on calls repeatedly, or he's called out Japanese technology and how important it has. You have India doing the same thing now. Everything has to be made in India. It's sort of pushing this message that we want homegrown suppliers, and I see this coming through in the UK as well. I think there's a desire on the part of politicians to use Open RAN to sort of give a spur to homegrown companies that actually don't really exist at the moment.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right. It's politicized. And in fact, I'm going to use this as a ramp onto the final topic, because it's politicized because because of the US hostility to China, as manifested in its hostility to Huawei. And so obviously the US and I've covered plenty of senators and FCC and that sort of thing going on about how Open RAN represents the best opportunity for vendor plurality to the exclusion of Chinese vendors.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing, and this is what will lead on to the Huawei topic, the US diplomatic influence is in some ways even more pervasive than I thought it would be. And basically they're able to come in and to a large extent dictate trade and industrial policy of nearly every other country in the world.
Yeah.
Basically by going, well, you don't want to piss us off.
Yeah.
Go on.
I mean, I was going to say one more thing about Open RAN maybe before you move it on.
Yeah.
And here's the big issue for me about Open RAN. If everybody decides they're going to be protectionist, and that they want to create homegrown champions, then we end up with a very fragmented market, with lots of players competing for business. Now that's clearly not going to work anyway, is it? How on earth does,
certainly not in terms of efficiencies.
How on earth does a homegrown player catering to a smaller market than Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei do ever? I mean, this is one of the big issues about why mobile has been such a success story over the last few years. That on the one hand we have consolidation that's left us with only 3 players, but those players have economies of scale that are probably unparalleled in any other industry. They employ Ericsson and Nokia 200,000 people, $9 billion a year on R&D facilities in all parts of the world. You're telling me that little Open RAN companies that come along that are spurred by the UK with a few subsidies,
UK Silicon Fen
are going to be able to develop equipment that's competitive in terms of equipment. And this is why I'm very dubious about the cost side of Open RAN. I don't believe that, Rakuten goes on about these cost savings. It's realised. I think a lot of that has come from the fact that they've built a network from the ground up, avoiding a lot of the complexity that some networks have had. I don't think it's necessarily to do with OpenRAN. No.
Okay. So yes, this sort of politicization of the telecom sector obviously affects Huawei more than anyone else. And just the latest development, I wrote a story, it's yesterday afternoon, but it's a lead story in today's newsletter, today being Wednesday. The headline was, Huawei's European legal challenge gathers momentum. It was basically, most of the credit for this story goes to Politico, not me. And they've got this guy, Lawrence, God knows how you pronounce his surname, Cerulus, something like that. Anyway,
right.
he's really strong.
Stories,
yeah, he's really strong on telecoms. And he actually submitted a Freedom of Information request to the European Commission to say, I want to see the correspondence you've had with Huawei on individual EU countries banning it.
Yeah.
And basically, in September, Huawei sent a letter going, we're not happy about Poland and Romania banning us. And of course they're not happy, but what's the legal reason? And their point is twofold. One is that discriminating against a company because of its country of origin contravenes European anti-discrimination law, which on the surface of it seems, fair enough. Because the whole reason these things are set up, that's a funny thing about the EU. Those kind of laws are set up to prevent discrimination between EU countries, like France discriminating against Germany or something.
Yeah.
But Huawei's going, well, doesn't it apply to all countries? They might want to get involved in the goddamn Brexit negotiations because they're certainly being prejudiced against us on those, he said.
Yeah.
Spinning his political position to the wall once more.
Don't hold back, Scott.
Yes, well, you know me. So that's a good point. And then their other point is, if you look at this draft law that the Poles and the Romanians are coming up with, it's almost word for word copied from a MOU they've signed with the Yanks on 5G security. And so they're basically saying, and this is what I find really interesting, they're basically saying, look, European Commission, your members are basing their policy more on what the Americans say than what you say. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good place to prod the EU on, because they're not into national sovereignty, but they're very into EU sovereignty.
Yeah.
They don't want anyone else poking their nose into EU business.
Do you know, I find this whole EU, where the Huawei sort of issue comes into, I find it very confusing. I really do, because it's almost like individual countries, on the one hand, they're taking their lead from these EU directives and documents. And then on the other hand, they just sort of move ahead anyway and do their own thing.
Like a two-speed type of thing.
France doing this thing where it's not going to renew Huawei equipment, apparently, when the licenses expire, not going to renew the licenses. And it kind of sums up EU telecom policy generally, I guess. And I suppose it just sums up the EU, is that there's this kind of clash between national policy and regional policy, and, no one's any the wiser. All it does is really create confusion, I think, and additional layers of bureaucracy.
Yes, you're preaching to the choir with me on that one.
Yeah, and I don't think it's but I don't think it's helping at all on the Huawei issue in terms of what countries do on it, because on the one hand, you seem to have officials who are waiting for the EU to take a firm stance, and you wait for the EU to do something like that, then Huawei will have gone out of business by then anyway. We'll all be living on Mars or something and eating potatoes that we've, produced in our own shit.
Have we ever talked about Nokia getting...
Hey, that's a great book.
Have we ever talked about Nokia getting the gig to do 4G on the moon?
Anyway. What was that all about?
Well, no,
that was a 14 million contract.
Yeah, well, we'd have time to get into it now.
We need it there.
That was about getting to Mars, like moon as a staging post for Mars. Anyway, yes, it is a tough one. Look, I'm not so blindly hostile to the EU that I can't see what the point of it is, and I can't see that it does good stuff occasionally. And obviously there has to be some degree of coordination, harmonisation of national policy, and that must be a difficult thing to do because you've still got sovereign governments and electorates making their own decisions. I would argue this is a central flaw in the whole European project alone. You either have to have the United States of Europe or just stop fucking about and let everyone get on with their own business. Yeah,
hence the euro problems, really.
Well, yes, like with the euro currency, and thank God we never signed up for that. Yeah. But, that's that, and we'll see how it goes. But yes, that's where Huawei's lawyers are being clever. They're basically saying, because they know there's a bit of niggle, especially in Eastern Europe. Poland's got quite a sort of right-wing government.
Yeah.
There's Hungary, which isn't mentioned in this context, but there's that aggro that goes on with Orban there.
Yeah.
And so they know. I think they just know which buttons to press.
Yeah.
To get the EU's attention. So fair play to them. As I wrote in my piece, it probably won't come to anything, but I can't fault their legal strategy on that one. Of going, are you going to let the Yanks tell your members how to
all
form
credit
policy?
to them. If they're trying to prop up their business and ensure it has some kind of future.
Yeah.
So you're gonna pull any levers you can, I guess. But I can't help feeling that they are ultimately out of Europe in the long run.
No, it feels like a rearguard action.
And I don't think Biden,
enough.
go back to the US election, I don't think Biden coming in is going to change that now. I don't think.
I take your point on that. I slightly differ from you in that I think Biden will continue to sort of talk a good game on it, but his actions, his party's actions, let's face it, Biden's going to do fuck all. Because he's not all there.
He's probably not capable of doing much.
He's not all there,
Harris.
But whoever Kamala Harris and whoever his proxies are, I think on the sly, just take it down a notch, definitely. Yeah. But yes, I think it is a rearguard action by Huawei. I think it's not a bad card to play. A bit too little, too late.
Yeah.
But fair enough. I actually respect Huawei for going down fighting on this stuff.
Yeah. A part of me almost feels sorry for them. All the shit they've had going on recently,
Yeah, until you figure how much help they probably had on the way up from the Chinese state.
Billions.
Yeah. But no, you're right. Where they are now,
part of me, it's a very small part that doesn't come out very often.
No, I mean individuals. If you're someone who works for Huawei now and you're into just doing your job well, and then you keep getting these spanners thrown in the works, then totally, I feel sympathy for them.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault that maybe 20 years ago there was a bit of shenanigans going on. So yes, I don't think due process is being preserved very well. There's not much hard evidence. I mean, we've been over this countless times. I won't dwell on it. Not much hard evidence, but as you say, momentum's against them. No matter who wins the general election, let's wrap it up here and sort of go full circle. No matter who wins the US general election, it's not good news for Huawei. It's and then there'll be a few other bits that we chatted about at the start to do with telecoms policy at the FCC. But yeah, we'll call it a day there. And we'll go off. So I finished mine. We're going to the pub because the reason we came in on Wednesday wasn't just because it's the last day we can come to the office.
I've seen some news. We can talk about it after.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe.
Well, anyway, notwithstanding what Pierre's about to say, not only is this the last day we're allowed into the office to do a studio one, but it's the last day that we're allowed to get to the pub. So, unless I hear otherwise, that's what's going on, and we're going to get a pub now. So, thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.